And a few days is about as much as most people can take it, so that's all right, thanks. My dad says that company is like fish. After a few days, it's really time to get rid of it. And I will move back up to the north here tomorrow. And I do all of your prayers. I appreciate it. Several of you have said, next time bring my wife. I would love to, and she would love to come. And it's entirely up to what her business is letting her do at the time. This week, for example, they built a house. And not just a house, but a house inside of a warehouse for the Michigan Expo, Design Expo. So people could come in and see all of the different things that she does. And this is rather a huge deal. So she couldn't leave and put old Duncan, in charge of it, because he would be shooting through the walls, having a great time. We are going to talk about rocks tonight, and there's a reason why. Now, this can get a little bit boring, and so I'm going to try not to let it be. I've even thought about bringing rocks and flinging them about the place, but I didn't do it. Let's just assume that I've got them and know how to use them. But the reason we've got to talk about this, there's a lot of things we haven't had time to discuss in Christian evidences. We've not talked about paleontology, about man's old bones, and we've not talked about transitional forms, and there's so much we've not reached. But I wanted to get to this one, because the number one problem most people have that'll hit their faith time and time and time again, and it starts early, very early. A kid will start watching shows that I like, by the way, like a Jeff Corwin Experience or Crocodile Hunter. Although my son has been in so many places, he's only 15-year-old I know that watches a Crocodile Hunter and goes, sissy. But it's, Duncan scares me a bit, but there it is. I'm not kidding when I say by the age of 11, when we lived in South Carolina, he would put on a boonie hat and a big knife and just walk off into the swamps. We would see him later that night, and he would have a big cooler full of flounder he'd gagged and talk about the alligators and the like. And I'm thinking, most 11-year-olds don't do this, son. But maybe he'll come down with me next time and protect me. Anyway, you watch one of those nature shows, you watch a Discovery Channel thing or the like, and everything they say will be about evolution. Somewhere they will put it in. And it's the massive time scale that throws most people. When they'll say, this rock or this bone, and then they will throw an age to it. What we're going to do tonight is going to be so stunning that many of you are going to have a hard time believing it. But when we're done, know this. I work at universities, and I throw this out in front of the geology department, and I don't get challenges back. They know what I'm saying. They don't believe that I'm right about where this is going, but they know the problems that they've got. I will illustrate this for once. For example, I was back in university, and we went to a point of geological interest. I know it was a point of geological interest because there was a large sign saying, point of geological interest. So we all pulled up to it, and we all decamped the bus, and standing all about, the teacher was going, this is a 12-million-year-old seam of rock here. And I'm going, how do you know? And he says, we found these fossils in it that are 12-million-year-old fossils. I said, all you've done is shove the question back one. How do you know the fossils are 12 million years old? He said, and I quote, and I'm not making this up, because we found them in this 12-million-year-old seam of rock. I stepped back and looked at him, and I said, do you see a problem with this? And he says, we're aware of this, and we're working on it. I said, it might be good to bring this up every now and then. It might be good to bring up that everything that you're talking about is based on circular reasoning. Where did this seam come from? He said, there once was a great Savannah. And Savannah's not a girl in Georgia. It's a big flat plain with bunches of plants. And he says, trees reached routinely 200 feet high. Grasses would be 80 feet high. And then when the Ice Age came, it all stomped it down, and this all became this coal seam, or this whatever seam is through here. I looked at him and I said, where are the roots? He said, excuse me. I said, you have a 200-foot tall tree. You've got some serious root systems. But what I see here is a clean line. Where are the roots? Got very quiet. We got back on the bus. I didn't get taken to a lot of field trips. But friends, first of all, the ages don't matter. I'm going to tell you that. We're talking from a scientific sense. Because the fact is, time is the enemy of evolution. It is not the friend. Let me explain this with just DNA. DNA, as we said the other day, if you just did the code of DNA, would be 2,000 volumes, encyclopedia-sized volumes, just to put the code down, not at all interpreting the code, which would take you a library, all right? So you've got 2,000 volumes. Think of the papers. Think of the pages in there, all right? We don't need to play with numbers here. Just think of the pages. Now, all the pages are loose, but they're in the right order. So we pick them up, we take them to an airplane. We fly 5,000 feet high and drop them. What are the odds that they're going to land in the right order? Not very good. So you know what? We need more time. Let's go up to 25,000 feet. Does this improve our odds? No. Time does not help you evolve. Time is a real enemy of evolution. And it's a real enemy of mathematics here, because mathematicians, by and large, have a real problem with biologists and zoologists and paleontologists. A real problem. And many of them will tell you to your face that 30 billion years is not long enough for life to have evolved, even if you had the head start with amoebas in a primordial ooze. 30 billion years is not long enough, according to a mathematician. A biologist argues with them. There is a big argument right now about Antarctica. The reason is that they have oil in Antarctica. That normally means there used to be tropics in Antarctica, and there was. They've dug down enough and found them, but they've also found dinosaur bones, which is a real problem. Because the dinosaur people say that Antarctica split off long before dinosaurs roamed the earth and got cold. The biologists are saying, no, it didn't. The zoologists are trying to devise a concept of dinosaurs after Antarctica broke off and got cold, getting on mats of vegetation and riding these primitive rafts to Antarctica and then freezing. I'm not making this up. I love going to conferences, especially whenever people will say things like, the church is so divided, how can it be a witness? And I'm thinking, you think the church is divided? Go to a science conference. The only thing keeping them from killing each other is the fact that most of them are nerds and don't know how. Sorry, it had to be said. I have a couple of friends that are pacifists, and I said, I don't mind you being pacifist. It just means it's easier to get your stuff. I'll tell you this, and I'll get back to this. Remember Y2K? Everybody was panicking. I lived in West Virginia at the time. This guy showed me all of his preparations in the water and the MREs he'd stacked and the like. And he looked at me and he goes, now, do you have your supply set aside? I said, no. He goes, you have something set aside? I said, no, I'm fine. And he goes, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I own firearms. I know where you live. Yeah, I'm a real hit at science conventions. All right. We have a problem. Because when they say life has been on the planet for 6 billion years, we only have solid evidence of human occupation going back to about 4,000 BC, and that's the outer limit. That's all we got. And when it shows up, it doesn't show up with two guys in clubs beating each other over the head. It shows up with people knowing accounting practices and languages and astronomy, and they come out of nowhere with music and poetry and literature. I mean, out of nowhere. You dig 2 feet beyond it, you've got nothing. You come up to here, you got a civilization, like Sumer and the others. Like in Egypt. There's no mark of Egypt before about 3600 BC. And then all of a sudden, there's Egypt. A real flourishing place. If we've been around as long as people say we've been around, we should have left more marks. And before you say, no, wait, they'll find a piece of flint. All right. First of all, be aware there's nobody ever found a piece of flint. That there haven't been 20 other people arguing, that's just a piece of flint. That's not a Clovis point. That's not an arrowhead. That's not, I love this one guy. All he does is collect pieces of flint and claim that this is from factories where they built arrowheads. He's never actually found one, just flint chips. But that's his proof. And I'm thinking, with a hammer and a big thing of flint, I can produce a factory for you. And yet, friends, what's going on here? How do you date a rock? You might be surprised. Let me do the negative. A rock is not dated by its appearance. Rocks that are dated as very old may look new and brand spanking new rock. And rocks that are dated as new might look very old and broken and seamed, unconsolidated rock. In other words, it's all crushed, and you might think, well, it's older, it's broken apart. No, not necessarily. They're not dated by their petrologic character either. In other words, you can't say, oh, it's limestone, therefore it's this old. Oh, it's granite, therefore it's... No, I'm sorry. You can't date rocks that way. Nobody does. There's no geology textbook that will even give it a try. Shales, granites, limestones, all of these are found in every strata all over the place. They're also not dated by the minerals in them. Oh, this has gold in it, this has silver in it, this has any of it. I'm sorry, but that doesn't date the rock either. There's new gold, old gold, and nobody knows the difference. They'd ignore that. They're not dated by the adjacent rocks. In other words, this rock is against this rock, which means, no, sorry, doesn't. You might be wondering how they date these. Hang on, we'll let you know. They're not dated, here's a kicker. You ready for this one? They're not dated radiometrically. Now, if you don't know what radiometric is, you're going to by the time the night's over. That's how they go, and they'll say, we have dated this thing, and we're dating it at 35 million. They used a radiometric method, but you do not measure the age of rocks by radiometric, except one kind of rock. And that's a rock that has been heated to the point it turned into liquid and then cooled and became a rock again. That's the ones they'll date. But most rocks aren't that. So how do they get the dates? They are dated by one thing: fossils. The dates of the fossils are not what determines the age of the rock. It is where that fossil belongs in evolution that determines the age of the rock. If you don't understand the point of this, let me explain this. Let me just go to a different thing and we'll come back to it. You've all seen a geologic column, haven't you? Right? Sometime or another you've seen in a book, there's this column that, you have this layer, then this layer, and that's where they got like the Jurassic Age. That's where they got that name from. It's one of those columns. And they'll say, this is the different rocks. Are you ready? Brace yourself. You got seatbelts. That exists nowhere on the planet. There is nowhere on the planet that you can dig and find the geologic column. I have said this in probably 40 major universities. And the only people that get mad at me are those who aren't geologists. The geologists sit there and just kind of go, it doesn't exist. Out of all of them, in fact, if you found the geologic column, it would have to be about 130 miles deep. And there's no place on the planet where the Earth's crust is more than 12 to 15 miles thick. Now, do some real quick math there, and you will realize that we have less than 9% of the geologic column anywhere on the planet. So what in the world is going on here? Here's a quote, but they only give this quote in master's or doctoral degree text. When you're if you have a bachelor's of geology, you believe all the myths. It's rather like a bachelor's of psychology. Sorry. We know when you're getting a bachelor's of psychology that we're teaching you rubbish. We're teaching you about Freud. There's a man who needed a shrink. That man needed to be put down and just wake up in a forest with a radio collar and an ear tag. That guy needed away from children and cigars and everything else. It was a very frightening fellow. But we teach you all the rubbish first. And then as you're in a master's degree, we'll say, now, remember everything you just spent $182,000 learning? Yes. Forget it. It's nothing. Now we have to tell you the truth. But by then you're already so sucked in, you're a believer. You got to be there. It's rather like trying to convert a clergyman of a denomination. When you show him he's wrong, he has a hard time leaving because he's got his pension, he's got his parsonage, he's got his... That's kind of the way they get this. But here's a master's degree book quote from Engel. If you're a geologist, you know that guy's name. No more than 1% or so of the history of the earth is decipherable. All right, stop right there. They only have 1%? Oh, but it gets worse. Quote again. But that 1% is dispersed through a series of events or episodes extending back through geologic time. In other words, it's all scattered, that 1% is. Quote again. By imaginative manipulation of the evolving data. In other words, we keep imagining a story that keeps changing. we can reconstruct a magnificent and awesome history of the earth and its life. What? In other words, sit back, children, once upon a time. In fact, if you ever go to the Grand Canyon, they'll talk about this shows billions of years of Earth's history, or at least 1 billion years. However, it has huge chunks missing. Do you know that there are 12 geologic eras, and the Grand Canyon only has 5 of them? And those 5 are out of order? That's the other kicker. When you do find bits of this column, it's never in the order it is in a textbook. It's out of order. We're told that the other bits eroded, but erosion's an interesting verb, because when something erodes, it must erode to. So where did it erode to? And the answer gets very, very quiet in the room. Did it just blow away? Space dust, maybe. And some of them will say, maybe. And I'll go, okay. Now I just want to know what I'm playing with. Friends, what do they say when they say the stratas are out of order? They'll say, well, there's this upheaval, and things flipped. But there's a problem. In the Grand Canyon, for example, there's a tree log, petrified log. Lies at a diagonal, goes through 3 of the available 5 geologic eras. If anything flipped, that log would have broken. You know, when a mountain hits a tree, mountain 1, tree nothing, basically. And yet, no, the tree died and settled and was petrified when these things were already set. How old's the tree? Well, they'll date the tree, and they'll say the tree is about 38,000 years old. And yet it is embedded in 3 eras of time that you say covers 300 million years. There's a problem here. Another one of this was at Ohio University. They were cutting, Ohio University really should belong to West Virginia, because if you've ever been in Ohio, I'm sorry, but really, there's a line somewhere between Lancaster, Ohio, and Logan, Ohio, where fish becomes fish, and the language changes, and all the way down to Athens, Ohio, you've got Ohio University. And they were cutting, the highway people were cutting through a mountain to put a road. And again, love America. They don't just go up, they just get that mountain out of there. And so they cut it through, and they found a petrified tree underneath a mountain. And the scientists were excited. They all ran out there, and they grabbed it, and they all took it back to the lab, and stuck it in there, and they did all kinds of tests, and it got very, very quiet. Because by all their tests, that tree was about 25,000 years old. On the bottom of a mountain, that was about 20 million years old. And it was a real quiet place in the lab. When I was sitting there, I was saying, I think I can explain it. And they go, what? I said, there's a bunch of cavemen. Now remember, they didn't have cable or malls, so they were a little bit bored. They just dug a hole and dropped the tree in, saying, this will really screw with their minds here in a couple million years. No, they date by fossils. And whenever the ages of those geologic columns were figured out, we had no radiometrics. We'll explain radiometrics in a bit. And the ages of those fossils were determined before we had radiometrics. When we developed radiometrics, none of these ages changed. Now that's a bit suspicious. Let me explain what I mean. They look for something in the rocks called an index fossil. An index fossil is a fossil of an animal that was fairly widespread, so you got a lot of them to compare with, fairly widespread, but did not exist for a great period of time. It became extinct so that it's a photo picture of something. There's not much development in it. That's an index fossil. Index fossils have already been determined how old they are. So whenever you find one in a rock, that's how old the rock is. How did they determine how old the index fossil was? That was done by the theory of evolution. It had nothing to do with radiometrics. And I'll give you an illustration of this in just a moment. You need to understand something. The evolutionary model is so tightly bound in presupposition that it is married to great ages. It is not allowed to look at any other evidence. The creation model is very fluid. We're allowed to look at any evidence. We're allowed to change, because we're not Bishop Ussher. We're not trying to say that the universe was created at 4004 BC. We're not doing any of that. We're just saying, let's see what the evidence says, guys. We're open. They're not. Let me give you an illustration. Let's say you were to look at me and say, Patrick, it's obvious. You're just way too stressed. We have a cabin off in the woods. Nobody has used that cabin in 5 years. We're just going to give you the key. You go on up, spend a couple of weeks there, enjoy yourself. And I say, thank you. So I take the key, go up to the cabin, unlock the door, open the door. Inside the cabin, there's a table. On the table, there's an ashtray. In the ashtray, there's a cigar, lit. Now, if I'm a creationist, I look at that and say, the evidence shows somebody's been here within 5 years. An evolutionist has to look at that and go, wow, how has that stayed lit for 5 years? And it breaks my heart, because these guys are smart in every other aspect of their life. But because their faith requires that they suspend judgment, they do. And that's just terrifying. Let me give you an example. Ready for this one? What is a radiometric? It's rather like this. Let's say that this was a rock. And I'm using the different colors because I like it that way, right? This is a rock. Rocks aren't one thing or another. They're always a mix. If this was a uranium rock, it would have some lead in it too. The reason is uranium's unstable. Think of one of your aunts. It's kind of like that. Oh, really? Mine are. Trust me. We could talk about my family one day. Maybe when I come back, I'll just bring a couch, lay down, and talk about them. Uranium's unstable, and every now and then an electron just flies right off there, and it becomes lead. Well, the uranium would be called the mother element, the lead, the daughter element. So when they get a rock, they measure how much uranium and how much lead, and that way they know how rapidly uranium turns into the lead, so they measure out the proportions, and they'll say, this rock is such and such years old. At least that's what they tell you. But it's a bit more complex than this. Let's say you find a fossilized clam. This is a true story. You take it to the geology professor. By the way, you can find fossilized clams everywhere. I found a fossilized clam. How old is this? And he'll say, I don't know. I can't help you. It's a fossil. We can't date it. What? You can't date it? You're a geologist. Well, it's not an igneous rock, a rock that got melted and hardened again. And you say, well, then who can date this? He says, well, go to the biology professor. So you go to him. You say, I got this fossilized clam. How old is it? He gets it, and he pulls a book off of his shelf on fossilized clams. Ladies, I know you've got complaints about your husband every now and then, but what if he was a guy that wrote books about fossilized clams? All of a sudden, your husband's looking all pretty good, isn't he? All right? Okay, there it is. So, no, some of them back there going, he looks like a fossilized clam. So he pulls off this book on fossilized clam, and they do have these books. And they flip through, and he flips through, looks, and he goes, there it is. It's an index fossil. It's a fossil that lives 320 million years ago. You get a little concerned here, because nobody ever really sampled this thing. Nobody put it in the computer. Nobody ran an ultraviolet light over it. Nobody did anything but looked at it and looked in a book. And so you're saying, how do you know? And they'll say, well, the development of the clam took a certain number of years. I'm sorry, but that's not an argument. That's an assertion. How do you know? Well, because that's the way it had to have worked in this framework. Is anybody going to measure the rock? You're a little upset. So he says, no, it's just not going to do it. And you say, well, how do you date rocks then, since most rocks don't have fossils in them? He goes, oh, you just look for the fossils near them. So you go out, you find another rock. It's a piece of hardened lava. It's an igneous rock. You go, woohoo, because you don't have much of a life either. So you run in with the rock, and you go to the geology professor, and you say, igneous rock, how old is this? And he says, can't help you. Sorry, you've got to go to the geophysics department. Okay? So you go down to the geophysics department. He gets so excited because he just doesn't get enough rocks. And so he's looking at this and he's going, yes, we can date it. What we'll do is we'll take a bit of it and we grind it and we separate it and we go through radioisotopes, checking the elements to see how much mother element, how much daughter element, and that'll tell us the age. And you say, great. So he sends it. By the way, there are only 2 labs in America that do this, and you have to tell them the target age you're looking for as you send the rock. That seems to me to be a problem, but who am I? So the rock is ground into powder, minerals are crystallized out of this thing. He analyzes the ratios, he solves the equations, brings you back in. You're so excited, you sit there and he goes, we did the uranium lead method, and we have determined that this rock is 500 million years old, plus or minus 20 million. Okay, it's a bit of a fudge factor there, but all right. And he says, so we decided to run a second test. We did potassium argon, because believe it or not, there's gas in rocks. It's a little hard to find it, but these guys are real steady. So potassium does become argon over time. So we ran that method, and it said that your rock is 100 million years old, plus or minus 2 million. 500 million versus 100. He says, so we ran another test. We did the rubidium strontium test. You go, rubidium strontium test. And he says, that gave us 325 million years, plus or minus 25 million. You're going, okay. He said, so we ran the rubidium strontium isochron test. Okay, then, now we're talking. Got those isochrons in the business, and so he did that one, and it gave 375 million, plus or minus 35 million. So your rock is between 98 million and 520 million years old. You're sitting there looking at your rock, going, how can I tell which one of these tests is right? And you know what the next question was? Do you find any fossils near it? Yeah, I found this fossilized clam. Well, how old did the biology professor say it was? 320 million years old. He goes, well then, the rubidium strontium dates are correct. And they say it with a straight face. That's what gets me. I'm thinking, nowhere in medicine could this be done. We either need to get out your appendix, remove a lung, or add another leg to your forehead. When do you ever get this? Can you get away with this at the bank? Whenever you say, no, my mortgage payment is either, and start flinging out dates, and then said, we compared it to our expectations, and we came out with a much smaller number than you did. This does not work in anywhere except a geophysics department, and on the Discovery Channel, and in magazines like this, and in your children's textbooks. You need to know it. By the way, another book you need to read has very little to do with this, but somewhat to do with this. Written by a fellow with 2 doctorates named Jonathan Wells, W-E-L-L-S, Jonathan Wells. It is available at Barnes & Noble. It is available on the web for used. You can even buy it cheaply. But it's a fairly new book, I'd say 3 years old maybe. It's called Icons of Evolution. Icons of Evolution. Jonathan Wells was a true believer until he started looking at the evidence. He unfortunately did another doctorate in the history and philosophy of science, which is a real hot degree right now, which is how do we know what we know degree. And as he went back and examined the evidence, he found out a lot of things, like, remember those peppered moth stories? About how the peppered moth landed against the tree, and when it was white, it was all right until the pollution came, and then all the white ones died because you could see them against the tree that was dark with pollution. And so the peppered moths that were dark only lived. And it's this whole thing about proving evolution in our time. Peppered moths don't land on trees. Those pictures, they were glued on. Science has known this for more than 40 years. But there are still some textbooks I bet you've got that have those peppered moths in it. And he goes through and grades textbooks, and it's terrifying. Now, he didn't run and jump in a baptistry, but he's getting closer. He's getting much closer. Jonathan Wells, called Icon of Evolution. Friends, what's going on here is going on elsewhere. But they'll say, but we know the rate at which... All right, hang on. Got a lot of presuppositions here. What you do is you find a rate at which uranium's becoming lead. Then you measure the lead and the uranium. You do your ratio. That's how you determine how long it took this thing to go from uranium to lead. Right? And they'll say, yes, that's exactly it. Don't you see the problem? Let's say that you're getting dead bored tonight, which is very possible. And let's say that Austin was also bored, and he's sitting up here. And he decides, right, I'm not listening anymore. I'm peeling potatoes. And he has a basket here with potatoes in it, unpeeled. And he has a basket over here where he peels a potato and he tosses the peeled potatoes in the other side of the basket. Are you with me so far? You, being bored, decide to watch him instead of me. And you wonder, how long has he been doing this? I hadn't been paying attention to Austin. How long has he been peeling potatoes? You start noticing that about every time that the second hen gets up to the 12, he picks up a potato, peels it. About the time it gets back up to a 12, he dumps one and picks up another one. So now you have observed the system. You have noticed the rate. Now you come up and look and you see 30 peeled potatoes. And you say, he's been doing this for 30 minutes. You have now extrapolated from the rate and the observation of the system. That seems so much like science, but it's not. You've got some problems. You don't know that the rate was constant because you only came in at the end. Could it be? He was a lot faster peeling those potatoes at first. Now he's slowing down, getting tired. Could it be? He was a lot slower at first peeling those potatoes, but now he's getting good at it. You don't know the rate was constant because you weren't there. Second problem. You don't know that somebody hasn't been messing with the basket and the count of potatoes. You weren't paying attention. You don't know if somebody came and put some more peeled potatoes in the basket or came and took some of his peeled potatoes away. There's no way to know how long he's been doing it merely by watching him peel a few potatoes. You don't know how much lead was in this rock originally. You don't know if lead was added to it because you see elements leach in to rocks and they leach out of rocks. No rock is a closed system. You don't know if anybody added potatoes or took them away, in other words. You don't know that the rate was steady because you weren't there when the rate was begun. You see our problem? And what if somebody cracked the rock here and left it, or cracked it here? You would get wildly different answers according to which rock you picked up. And it originally was one rock. There's nothing about this which is science. This is not science. This is, and I don't mean to offend anyone, but this is very much like waving around the Book of Mormon saying that that proves Joseph Smith was right. I'm sorry. The evidence does not back you up. It's not the way that this works. We have got to be a little bit more serious about this. The fact is, uranium elements only exist in open systems, which means systems in which elements are coming in and going out. So there's no way you can use uranium. Potassium and argon, sorry, argon's a gas. You can't measure how much is escaped. You can't measure how much is leached in. It's impossible. It'd be like you walking into a room saying, hey, 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 there's a molecule that doesn't belong here. I'm sorry, you don't know. This is a problem. This is why evolutionists date rocks by the place they need to be in their system, not by any hard science. None. In fact, there are several problems with the way that they date things. Real evidence for a long history of the earth is their textbooks. Every other bit of evidence that we've got indicates this earth's not that old. Let me give you some illustrations. And by the way, this is not by any stretch of the imagination an exhaustive list. There are tons of evidences that this earth and the universe is not that old. Let's just look at a few of them. Number one, remember, we have no provable dates of any human moving about before, and let's just go ahead and be very kind, 6,000 BC. Really, 4,000 BC is much truer. Well, let's give you a little bit. Nothing. No evidence. In fact, we have some problems if we want to make it old because there's too little helium. You see, when uranium becomes lead, it releases helium. Now, I sound like I've inhaled a lot of helium, but I always wanted one of those great FM voices. You know what I'm talking about? Instead, I sound like Mickey Mouse on helium, wearing a kilt. Anyway, when uranium becomes lead, it releases helium. However, when we measure the amount of helium in the atmosphere, it is way too small for the Earth to be anything over 10,000 years old. We don't have enough helium. So what they say is, it's escaped into space. We can't find helium in space, though. So it must have really run far. This is a problem. In fact, when we sent up probes for them to measure helium, they found that more helium is entering the atmosphere than leaving it, which means that Earth would be even younger. Therefore, that's why it wasn't on the front page of your papers. Cosmic dust is constantly coming into our atmosphere. Now, that's not the same as the dust in your house. The dust in your house is mainly you. It's bits of you coming off. I don't know if you're aware of this, but it is. That's so whenever you're pledging something, you're really wiping up after your kids. You're really wiping up after your kids. So it's all right. But there is cosmic dust coming into the atmosphere all the time, and it has certain elements in it. If we were a 5 billion year old planet, which is the average guess right now, 5 billion years. If we were, we should have a layer of cosmic dust 183 feet thick. We don't. Well, has it just settled? Has it eroded? Settled to where? Eroded to where? You can't get away with this by moving the problem to another area. You have to find that other area, or you cannot assume there was any erosion. Because the problem is, friends, if it eroded too, it still would have left the elements it's made out of. Cosmic dust is made out of 2.5% nickel. Nickel is a very rare element in our atmosphere. The only way we really get it is through the cosmic dust. If we had a 5 billion year old planet, we should have 3,000% more nickel than we've got. If we're old, why'd the nickel just start showing up recently? What's the problem here? In fact, the amount of nickel in the ocean that can be accounted for by 9,000 years of rivers running to the sea, taking soil with them. We can account for all the nickel in the ocean in 9,000 years. So what happened before? And speaking of oceans, if nickel came in at the current level for the last 5 billion years, the ocean would have 960 pounds of nickel for every square foot of ocean floor. And it doesn't, because, well, you know that, because if you have that much nickel, you also have dead everything. Nickel is not a nourishing element. All right, kids, eat your nickel. You know, you rarely hear this for a good reason. The same calculation can be made for all of the other elements in the sea, whether it is salt, whether it is iodine, whether it's gold. There's gold in seawater. It's just, you might say, "Ooh, we're rich." No, I'm sorry. Yeah, it costs way too much to get it, but it's there. But we can account for every single element in the ocean in 9,000 years. We can't find a reason why the Earth would be older by looking at the elements. The decay of the Earth's magnetic field. Are you aware of this? The magnetism is getting weaker rapidly. And some of you are thinking, I knew there was something going on. No, it's not like you'd notice. But remember when magnets were discovered, they were lodestones, just naturally magnetic rocks. And you could put them in bowls of water and they would turn toward north. You don't find a lot of lodestones anymore. The reason is, at the rate that we're noticing, let me get this right, the Earth's magnetic field has a 1,400-year half-life. In other words, it's decaying to the point where we have half the magnetism, not gravity, but magnetism, that they had 1,400 years ago. If we take that back a little bit further, if we go back 10,000 years, that would be the limit for human life, because by then the magnetism would be so strong as to actually pull the elements in the body and bloodstream out of whack and you would die. But you didn't. Therefore, there's something going on here. How about human population? Start with one man, one woman, good set there. That's why God did Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. He knew the way this worked. And so you got Adam and Eve going, all right, fair enough. You can have 6 billion people in 1,100 years. Well, we may have 6 billion on the planet just now. But friends, we've got a little issue here. If we've been around for 250,000 years, where are the people? Some will say, well, it was death and disease. No, that's factored into this. War is factored into this. Where are the people? It's a real issue. In fact, there are some population people today who will tell you we're close to overpopulating the earth. You ever flown over the earth? The earth exists as a large number of vast empty spaces. It is amazing how people buy this. In fact, right now, I just read an article this week where underpopulation has now become the most serious issue in Europe and several other places, and it's coming here, where we don't have enough babies to provide the services for those of us that are getting older. In America, by the way, you would have had all the babies you needed if you hadn't killed 1.5 million a year in abortion. There would be no Social Security crisis, no Medicare crisis, none of it. Isn't it interesting that for choice, and so we could be free, we killed babies only to end up to starve to death when we got older? The Bible says, be not deceived. God is not mocked. It also says, be sure your sins will find you out. We need to remember that as we go into an election year. There's some more here that we could go to and we could go through. But what several of you have said, we need to ask a question every now and then. We're going to die. And when I walk in, people say, got a question. And that's fine, by the way. That's not a complaint at all. And so I'm going to let you think about questions for just a minute. But while you're doing this, let me give you a quotation from my favorite evolutionist, who is Stephen Jay Gould, died recently. And even though he really just was absolutely anti-creation, at least he was honest about what the evidence looked like. And he talked about where the fossils are in this geologic column. And you may not be aware of this, but they all appear at once in the Cambrian layer. Every major form of invertebrate life shows up there, and nothing before. He put it this way: all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major forms, between major groups, are characteristically abrupt. In fact, he goes on to say, our view of evolution causes more problems than it solves when it comes to the fossil record. At least he was honest about it. We can go to Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls has well, we'll get to Niagara Falls. First of all, someone did ask me a question in the back. They talked about when we date a rock, we know how old it is. What kind of date do we get? Like from Mount St. Helens. It's forming new rock. Well, there's a rock in Sunset Crater. This has been going on for 40, 50 years. There's a Sunset Crater in northern Arizona, has been producing lava flows. Whenever it hardens, we take it, we run it through the radiometric. We get ages of well into the millions of years when we saw the rock being made. And we find that the mother element and daughter elements are already together in the rock. It didn't start out as a mother rock, slowly becoming something else. If every single time we date something, we know how old it is, we find that our radiometrics gives us the wrong date. Why should we accept the dates when we don't know how old something is? For example, Indians, Native Americans, talking about their forest and the like, will talk about trees planted by certain people, and we'll go and we'll say, this is a 300-year-old tree. We know it is because the Indians told us this. And we know, and we can even cut little sections and get this from it. But if you date that tree, you'll get a potassium-argon age of 485,000 years. Those are the kind of numbers we're dealing with here. If you know how old it is, radioisotope doesn't work. If you don't know how old it is, it's supposed to work just fine. Niagara Falls. Don't know if you've ever been there. I go up there a lot. Canadians don't like me much, though. And the reason, it's kind of my fault, too. I drive a big truck that has a couple of shooting stickers on it because I'm a competitive shooter. Like most preachers, I'm a very dangerous fellow. And our elders' meetings don't last that long. I'm just sitting there cleaning the guns, and everybody's very polite. And every time I go into Canada, they don't like me coming in because they're just certain I'm smuggling something. Just me and that big old truck. I did learn something, though. I don't want to explain how I learned this, but when they ask you if you have any weapons, don't say, what do you need? Certain rate. We know the rate. It erodes that escarpment 4 to 5 feet every year. Now, they've slowed it down in recent years by stopping the falls and running metal rods down through, but we've known this forever, 4 to 5 feet a year. Simple division shows us that it took 9,000 years to form this entire system. because you just go from one lake to the other and you back it up the river to see where the falls are at 4 or 5 feet a year. Starts at 37,000 feet. You come to 9,000 years at the current rate. But we don't even know. Was there more water in the past? Something called a global flood. That would have sped up that rate quite a bit, don't you think? And so it could be a lot less than 9,000 years. But it's very interesting. Charles Lyell, the father of modern geology, visited Niagara in 1841. He wanted to find out the rate so he could see how old the rocks were. The Indians told him 4 to 5 feet a year. The locals told him 4 to 5 feet a year. That was not going to give him the number he wanted. So he told everyone it went at the rate of much more than this. In fact, much less than this. That only eroded 1 foot a year. And that gave the age 35,000 years, which proved the Bible was wrong. He actually said this. He is the father of modern geology, and it started with a lie at Niagara Falls. Now you know. And people always ask me, if this is so known, why do people still believe? Because that's where you get your paycheck. That's where you get your funding. Why are some scientists screaming, we need stem cells, we need stem cells? Sorry, but you've already got more stem cells than you're using. The president already released a bunch, and only about 20% of them are being used. Well, why are they yelling this? Because they're not worried about stem cells. They're wanting the funding. Remember, the main number one purpose of any group is to survive. Get the funding. If there's an environmentalist group, will it ever say, we're doing pretty well? No, you won't get funding. It'd be like a church. It'd be like Jim Dillinger standing up here on Sunday morning saying, we've checked the sin situation in Noblesville. We have achieved parity. But your money in your pocket, we seem to be doing all right. No sins here. No. All of us have, I believe, bless you, and I work for God, so that's God. Did you feel the power? That was, anyway. I said that to a lady once in church, and she laughed for a while, and she went, wait a minute, I do too. I said, that's right. That's right. We're all powerful beings. All right, any last questions before I ride off into the mist and sunset and the ice and penguins? Yes, sir. Right. All right, excellent point. I did not mention carbon dating because it is vastly complex and I need the PowerPoint for it. Let me just explain. Carbon dating, when something that is alive dies, everything that's alive is a carbon-based life form. Anybody who ever watched Star Trek knows that because they always brought that up. It's only science in Star Trek. So, and they had room for more science because there was no acting. But anyway, all life is carbon-based. When it dies, this carbon leaves the system at a certain rate. Unfortunately, it does not leave at a steady rate. And I don't know of anybody who would disagree with me on this, really, anyone. Because a lot of factors, if the thing dies in water, if the thing dies and is dispersed, in other words, a bomb blew you away, the carbon's going to move different ways, all right? It leaches in and out of systems. And carbon can reset. If you had a global flood, you'd have a massive resetting of carbon. But there's another problem with carbon dating. If you're talking about relatively recent things like dead trees, or the squirrel in the backyard or something, carbon dating is actually pretty good. It is when you try to stretch it out and make it do what it is not designed to do. And the guy that invented carbon dating spent the rest of his life trying to get people to stop using it for anything more than a few thousand years old. Now, like I just brought up a while ago, I'm a shooter. My son is also a shooter. I do competitive combat pistol. My son does long-range rifle. And because we go together to matches, sometimes I do a little bit of his work and he does a little bit of mine, all right? Have you ever watched a cowboy show where they're riding on a horse? The Indians are over there 200 yards away riding horses. And he pulls the pistol. And I don't know why they don't even aim it. They just go bang. And an Indian and the horse falls down too. Not going to happen. You see, a pistol not only the short barrel, most pistol bullets will stabilize in a short barrel. That's not the issue. The issue is the aiming. You have a short radius. And so you only have this kind of radius. A rifle, you can have a longer radius. The longer radius, the more accurate you're going to be. Carbon is a short radius tool. It works really well at short ranges. Unfortunately, most of the carbon dates you'll get are things like, we carbon dated this guy in the ice, and he's 37,000 years old. And the guy that invented it, perfected it, screams. Because it's not made to do that. Yes? No, as I brought up on Sunday, and again I think it was on Monday that I brought it up, that there are two different forms of evolution. There is macroevolution and microevolution. Microevolution occurs every day all around you. You can hybrid plants, for example, or hybrid people. Almost everybody in here is hybrid, aren't you? Aren't you? There's no such thing as a pure race. I'll put it that way. In fact, kind of fun. If you get on the cellular level, which is where I work most of the time, you would know that if we had African Americans sitting in here, by the time we left after an hour or so, some of your cells would be now working in their body and some of their cells working in your body. Because cells move about. And it's kind of cool once you realize this and you're talking to a bunch of racists and you're thinking, you thought you were pure. But no, we're talking about macroevolution. And another talk we didn't do, which may address your point more directly, is people will say, are you totally against theistic evolution? The idea that God directed evolution. And I'd have to say, yes, I am, for biblical reasons, plus there's no evidence to make me run to it anyway. The biblical reasons are several. In 1 Corinthians 15, we're told, for example, that there was no blood and death until there was sin on the earth. But if you've got millions of years of things, walking around that weren't quite human, hitting each other over the head, you've got problems explaining why there wasn't blood and death until sin entered. Plus, when did somebody become a soul? Is Adam and Eve wrong? Is that story gone? If that is, then you've got a problem because Jesus believed it and quoted it and then said everything Moses wrote was true. And if Jesus is wrong about that, he could be wrong about salvation and baptism and everything else. You see our problem? So I have a theological problem with theistic evolution. Do I believe you can be a theistic evolutionist and get to heaven? Absolutely. I just think it's harder. The thing which really annoys me is the number of people who disagree with me that are going to go to heaven anyway. But anyway, maybe I'm not even touching your question. Well, I do not, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I do not believe that we were brought to this place by directed evolution. No. That's absolutely right, but that's microevolution. That's microevolution, and I absolutely agree with you. Where'd the races come from? By the way, it doesn't take long to get a race. First of all, I'm using the term race, but technically there is one race called human. All right? We understand this. In fact, when we do organ transplants, we very frequently find that, let's say a white fella needs a kidney, and we do tissue matches all over the city trying to find one for him. We frequently find the best match is from an African American. I've just seen it happen so many times. Better than the man's own family. We're the same race. Now, where do we get races? Let's talk about this, because you're absolutely right, and I believe the Tower of Babel story. When people go into Africa, there's a problem. It's sunny. It's hot. If you're pale, you're in danger, because only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun, as the old song goes. And pale people will develop much quicker melanomas, skin cancers of various types. They will have strokes. They will have difficulty regulating heat. Who is it that survives the best in hot weather? People with a lot of melanin. Black people. And as they marry each other, and they get blacker, because here's a little clue. To have babies, you've got to be alive. All right? It is the survivors who breed. It is very easy to see how in a hot area, an arid area, the blacker you are, the better you survive, which means the more babies you'll make, which means your genes get passed on. Now, let's go up to Norway and Sweden. All right? There's up there. And, I always loved the Swedish Chef. I thought that was hilarious. Anyway, a lot of you don't know what that is, but there you go. You don't have to know. You probably get to go to heaven anyway. In Sweden, if you were a dark person, and we have this problem, by the way, this is not spinning out of whole cloth. Medical doctors have this problem. In Sweden, you have a larger group now of immigrants coming that are darker skinned. Their children have to be carefully monitored for rickets. You know what rickets is? It's a disease of a lack of vitamin D. Where do you get vitamin D? The pills don't give you much. If you're taking them, sorry, they're not giving you much. And besides, don't take them. It's kind of dangerous if you take a bunch of vitamin D. You get it from the sun. But you can only get it from the sun if the sun can get through your tissues, which means not a lot of melanin. The darker you are, the less chance of survival in the cold northern climates. Once again, it doesn't take long to develop these characteristics because there's another factor at work. Let's say that I want to go get married. I tend not to find somebody who's 12 foot tall and purple. I want to find somebody who's kind of like us. Because we think people like us look pretty, which means our children will look even more like us, which once again is a line of separation. It's microevolution, and of course that occurs. My own family, by the way, when we adopted the last one, somebody said, "Are you trying to get one of every color?" And we said, "Yes, we want the whole set." My Guyanan sister, who is 16 years old, is about this tall, looks like an Aztec princess, very dark skin, very dark hair. Who's she going to marry? Probably not another Guyanan. Not a lot of them about. Answer is white, black, red, purple, gray. I don't care as long as they're a Christian. But when their children are born, you will see microevolution at work. But you won't see macro because it was still two people bringing a people. Yes. Yes. All right. The question was, how many times do I think the magnetic poles have switched? And I'm going to be very open with you here. I'm not qualified to even make a guess. I will tell you that the guesses are running from 3 to over 30. But that's not my science. I can just tell you, everybody admits that it has switched. But I'm not qualified to answer the question. All right? I can direct you to people that are. But was another hand over here? I thought I saw. All right, over here. Yes. You're absolutely right. This is one of the big problems right now. We've determined, I say we, scientists have determined that the magnetic field has a 1,400-year half-life. Will it happen? One of the questions, going back to hers there, is when it gets to a certain point, will it then switch and crank back up? And what's a mechanism? And the people who believe that the Earth is like a huge battery are pushing that one. And they could be right. But you're absolutely right. When the magnetic field decays, there are serious consequences for all of us. By the way, it has nothing to do with if you drive a SUV or not. And I'm not saying the Earth's not getting warmer. I think it is. But I do believe it's one of those natural things. Do you know that England used to be tropical? It's not now, but it used to be. And I don't want to keep you too late because I know kids have school. You know, here's the deal. Do I know everything there is to know about science? Are you kidding? No. People ask me, are you going to write some books on this? I write books on psychoneuroimmunology, which is a Greek term that means there are no jobs in this. What were you thinking? I write medical textbooks about psychology at the cellular level, immunology at the cellular level. I talk about electronic pathways and stuff. That's what I write about. And I want to tell you something about science books. You cannot bring a science book home before it's out of date. We're learning a lot. And I don't want anybody to interpret anything I have said in the last 4 days to indicate that I think scientists are silly, because I love them. Not only am I a scientist, but I love the fact that I can drive a car, fly an airplane. If I get sick, I can go buy 5 cents worth of aspirin and lower a fever. I thank God for scientists. And if your kid wants to be a scientist, encourage them, but make sure their faith is strong so that they can tell fact from fable as they go through. And in all things, understand this: Christians are the first ones who say, examine it. Examine our faith. Check it out. We don't ask you to do anything because we said so. We say, check it out. And I don't understand everything that God wants. I don't understand everything in Scripture. But I understand enough to get to heaven, and so do you. If you know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, if you know you need to belong to him to get to heaven because he is the way, the truth, and the life, and you want to belong to him, and the Bible says to do that, you have to be baptized. You know enough to get started right now. And Jim's here, and he is a good man. I don't say that about every minister I go visit. I don't stand up and say he is a bad man either, but I just leave that bit out. I just say, so long it's been good to know you. That's it. But you've got a very excellent man here who's not just a good minister, he's a good man. And he would sit down and answer your questions about what Jesus wants from you. But you need to let him know who you are. If you're ready to become a Christian, or if you want to know more about it, let him know by stepping forward as we stand and sing.